The Unquiet Dead, Anarchism, Fascism, and Mythology. Section 1. Fascist Ideology in Germany and Further. In Nazi Germany, questioning the validity of racism and anti-Semitism was like questioning the existence of the world. Hannah Arendt. The emotional background of fascism is one of failed dreams. For Germany, long a feudal collection of principalities struggling towards cultural and political unity, these dreams were winning the First World War and, after its defeat, redemption through the Weimar Republic. Unification being a social process rather than a matter of political decree, Germany found the Weimar Republic a disappointment. As George Moss observes, experiences rarely, if ever, turn out as anticipated, and this is especially true if the anticipation has gone on for a long time. For many German thinkers, the anticipation of unity had grown to almost messianic dimensions, and the confrontation with Bismarck's bloodless realpolitik was a tremendous disappointment. At first, the new Reich was greeted with great enthusiasm, but the kind of enthusiasm it received is more properly reserved for religious experiences, not political ones, and the business of government is hardly designed to produce a continuing state of ecstasy. Modernity and its corresponding alienation played just as large a role in the turn towards fascism as these failed political solutions. Quote, many turned from rational solutions to their problems and instead delved into their own emotional depths. The longing for self-identification, the individual's desire to fulfill his capacities, ironically heightened by the process of alienation, was accompanied by the contradictory urge to belong to something greater than oneself, a striving that inevitably circumscribed the individual's independence. These existential problems were very real, but the Volkisch, populist, roughly, I preserve the German to distinguish this particular movement from other populist movements. The Volkisch tendency they generated represented a flight from them rather than a tangible solution to them. An ideology that was only vaguely relevant to the real problems facing the German people ultimately became normative for the solutions to those problems, that is, the broadening of their long-nurtured dream of racial and cultural superiority. They at last found the unity they sought in hatred. This pattern repeats itself today as right-wing populist rhetoric calls for the expulsion of immigrants rather than labor rights for all. It is the nature, I say advisedly, of the beast. The Volkisch ideology is essentialist. It is reminiscent of Lamarckian biology, a pseudoscience which argues that biological shifts not only occur in response to environments, but that habits, lifeways, can be physically as well as culturally inherited. The Volkisch believers elevated this theory to a moral precept. For an individual to be rooted in their landscape meant that they are correctly connected to and expressing the cosmic life force of their Volk in their lifestyle, actions, and way of thinking. This viewpoint continues to hold currency in many other cultural contexts, including among many who neither view themselves as racist nor hold the social power necessary to actually be racist. In a manifestation most difficult to dismiss, many indigenous people express a sense of connection to the land, of an inherent need to practice the lifeways that have been frequently denied to them by occupiers. These expressions, frequently part of a resistance culture I honor, are sometimes flavored by essentialism, though one not typically based on the sort of power that makes oppression on its basis possible. I find this tendency neither possible to fully support nor to condemn, and explore its particularities in later sections. However, those whose race has been endowed with social power have very often weaponized it for destructive purposes. This is the most successful possible outcome for all essentialist projects in a world woven through by power dynamics. That fact makes essentialism itself the enemy, not only racism. While he was not formally connected to the Volkisch movement, Richard Walther Daré popularized the phrase blood and soil as a means of summing up the push for a natural renewal via the Volkisch mindset. While Daré initially found favor within Nationalist Socialist administration, he was, quote, gradually marginalized from power. His schemes were not only utopian, but conflicted with the massive industrialization demanded by the Nazi war machine. I also find Blood and Soil a useful shorthand for Volkisch thinking as the basis for National Socialism. The German people, defined not by citizenship nor by residence in Germany, but by blood, were connected to the land. They deserved all of their land, or even more of it, for living space, and would accomplish that goal by both purifying their blood and spilling that of others. It is both the importance of blood as a means of legitimizing residency and belonging, and its relationship to the land that I find essentialist. Here I will mainly discuss the evolution of German fascist ideology from the Volkisch movement, with a short detour into fascist Italy's race thinking to highlight commonalities and difference in fascist ideology. I will discuss Italian fascism in more specific detail in the next chapter. Context. The German soil was made ready for fascism by economic downturn and the failure of the left to fully seize its opportunities. By the end of World War I, the empire was replaced by the Weimar Republic, and hundreds of thousands of civilians had starved. Both the economy and general morale were at incredible lows. Many Germans, especially those returning home from war, felt betrayed by the new government that ended the war. Their heroic war, a war that should have proven the superiority of the Volk, had ended badly. They needed someone to blame, and they needed another chance to prove themselves. Meanwhile, as the economy worsened and the middle and upper classes turned right, the working class turned left. A revolutionary wave was sweeping Europe in response to the Russian Revolution, and Germany was deeply affected. A myth spread that German revolutionary forces had attacked the German army from the rear. Now known as the stab them in the back legend, this myth has been debunked, but was a substantial source of paranoia and antagonism at the time. The real story of the left's defeat is more typically depressing. Huge strikes broke out in 1918, and Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht formed the Spartacus League out of the Social Democrat Party in response to this energy. In November of 1918, several military ships mutinied. When their crews were arrested, thousands of protesters came out in solidarity with them. After these protesters were fired upon by the military, the protest turned into a large-scale revolt. Several cities were taken by mutinied soldiers and striking workers. A Soviet republic was established in Munich, led by socialists and anarchists. As the revolt continued to spread and the leaders of component countries of the empire began abdicating, the revolution was co-opted by the Social Democrats, who began making decisions contrary to revolutionary goals. The Spartacus League and the KPD at large resisted this in the January revolt of 1919, but were crushed by the Free Corps, quote, troops who had refused to demobilize after the war and who became attracted to Volkisch ideals. Originally the Kaiser's tool for attacking revolutionaries, these troops were now deployed by the SPD against their former comrades. Around 1,000 supporters of the Soviet Republic were killed. Rosa Luxemburg's body was dumped in a river. Karl Liebknecht was delivered to a morgue. Other revolts and strikes followed, but the end was in sight. The German Revolution ended in April 1919 when the Weimar Republic was officially established. Although many of the revolutionaries were inspired by communist, socialist, and anarchist ideas, the SPD instead formed a democratic republic, at least officially in an attempt to avoid civil war between the German right and left. This concession proved to be of dubious value. A large part of the bourgeoisie entered the Weimar Republic, unwilling to participate in democracy. They believed the political parties only served to divide the Volk, as, by this point, the Volk was a primary ideal for the German right. As we shall see throughout this text, fascist reaction nearly always takes place upon the failure of the revolutionary left to fully realize their ideals. The reconstituted Conservative Party of the 1920s, the DNVP, quickly became the dominant party in the Reichstag. Volkisch ideology and anti-Semitism were central. Quote, by the 1920s, the Jew had become a principal figure in Volkisch ideology and in much of conservative thought both inside and outside the DNVP, and was absolutely essential to the endurance of the ideology. By the 1920s, kids were playing Aryans and Jews, as, in other times and places, they played cops and robbers, or cowboys and Indians. One, the Volk, blood and soil. Volk is the German word for people. It came to represent the true common German, who lived in a rural environment and embodied the virtues of the land. It refers not simply to a collection of bodies, but to the essential spirit of a people. What makes Germans German? The Volkish movement that existed during the 70 years before the Nazi Party took power in Germany prepared the way for it, created the social and philosophical conditions necessary for National Socialism to find such general acceptance, and, later, for the justification of its most vicious policies. This philosophy, one of going back to the land, of restoring the natural correspondence between the German people and their surroundings, and, later, of ridding the land of its parasitic modernist invaders, is deeply essentialist. It is based in romanticism and nostalgia, and in the myth of eternal return and rebirth so important to fascism. Without its felt justification in nature, however, it would have few of its teeth. The philosophy began innocently enough with Johann von Herder, an early German romantic philosopher who wrote in the late 18th century. He theorized that each culture shaped the character of its Volk. A multiculturalist, he did not think any Volk was superior to any other. He further theorized the existence of the people, a central Enlightenment concept, as opposed to the old framework of the masses versus the aristocracy, and affirmed the importance of national identity. At first, his ideas led to a mere affirmation and celebration of German culture. For instance, the brothers Grimm were inspired by his writing to collect their, essentially German, folk tales. Later, more mystic romantics drew from his ideas to try to solve social problems. They believed one could alleviate the individual's sense of modern alienation by accessing a sense of shared, cosmic life energy that flowed from nature, through the Volk, into the individual. George Moss explains, "The human soul could be in rapport with nature since it too was endowed with the soul. Every individual could therefore find an inner correspondence with nature, a correspondence which he shared with his Volk. In this way the individual linked himself with every other member of the Volk in a common feeling of belonging in a shared emotional experience. Yet, after all, the Volk did not have universal dimensions, but was linked to a particular national unit. Not all of nature, therefore, but only its regional manifestations gave the Volk its character, potential, and unity. Nature was defined as landscape, those features of the environment peculiar and familiar to the members of one Volk and alien to all others. The landscape thus became a vital part of the definition of the Volk, through which it retained continuous contact with the life spirit of the transcendent cosmos. In this respect, the desired reality was charged with both emotional value and rural aspirations, reflecting quite explicitly the Volkish desire to escape from and to negate the validity of the century's increasingly industrial and urban values. When one holds a religious faith in what one believes to be the natural order, nature is the primary source of revealed truth. Science is sometimes used to justify this faith by defining the natural order. However, as periodic revolutions in the sciences have shown us, each scientific theory and justification is quite limited, replaced in time by a better theory, with its own faults and limits. This fuzziness does not tend to make us generally skeptical of science. Rather, it allows believers in nature to disregard science when it is not convenient to them, and rely instead on what everyone knows, that is, a common sense defined by the values of the class or race in power. This was the case for the Volk. Adherents to the Volkish philosophy idealized the simple life of the countryside and argued that German society would be best improved by a return to rural values and practices. Quote, "Man was seen not as a vanquisher of nature, nor was he credited with the ability to penetrate the meaning of nature by applying the tools of reason. Instead, he was glorified as living in accordance with nature, at one with its mystical forces." This line of thought is echoed today by various back-to-the-land movements, fascist or otherwise. Cities and modernity are seen as social and environmental problems, and people of all sorts of political affiliations desire to escape them. The Volkish philosophy did not idealize nature in the sense of wilderness, but a domesticated, agricultural nature, the countryside. Quote, "In taming nature, Volkish thinkers rehabilitated it as a landscape filled with flora, fauna, villages, and small rustic peasant farms, entities which had lived within nature so long that they had become an integral part of the countryside." One thinks of the American conservative nostalgia for the family farm as much as, or more than, the American liberal and libertarian homesteading movement here, but I would argue the same impulse motivates them all, the fear of modernity as it is represented by cities and their dangerous, decadent, racially and sexually diverse environments, and a recognition of the alienation generated by capitalism and a lack of control over one's own life. It is of note that white-owned single-family homes in the suburbs were encouraged in the U.S. after World War I by the federal government in a policy intended to limit the spread of Bolshevism. Hoover, then the Secretary of Commerce, thought that racial mixing in diverse cities would contaminate native-born Americans with communist ideas. Many Volkish participants started land projects, some of which still exist in Germany today, with varied politics. Others formed youth movements designed to reinculcate rural values of strength, independence, and relationship to nature in German children. These youth movements were later immensely useful to the rise of National Socialism, as children who grew up in them became fascist adults, or as the movements themselves became explicitly fascist. Most Germans did not actively participate in the Volkisch movement, but, as a cultural backdrop, it was a vital force for affecting their worldviews. Most dangerously, it created and/or reinforced an other, the Jew. The restless class of people, the industrial proletarian, the migratory worker, the open homosexual, the young urban intellectual, these were all seen as rootless, inauthentic representations of modernity. Quote, "Above all, there was the Jew, who by his very nature was restless. Although the Jew belonged to a Volk, it occupied no specific territory, and was consequently doomed to rootlessness." This also serves as a basis for the intense Nazi persecution of Roma people, more commonly known by the racist term gypsies. In analyzing one of many popular anti-Semitic novels of the time, Moss observes, "In this framework, the Jew was identified with modern industrial society, which uprooted the peasant, deprived him of his land, caused his death, and thereby destroyed the most genuine part of the Volk. Some Jewish people did indeed serve as moneylenders, intermediaries between poor peasants and capitalist forces. This was one of the few economic roles historically permitted to Jews. Indeed, Jews were forced into this position as moneylenders and points of exchange became vital to society, as Islam and Christianity both prohibited the collection of interest. This meant that, to the debt-ridden peasant, the Jew represented the most easily identifiable and immediately present element of the greedy power of modern capitalist civilization. Therefore, Jews were not only seen as invaders, but their perceived rootlessness was believed to be the source for predatory behavior that threatened the rightful inhabitants of the land. Essentialism was also a factor within Jewish movements. Some German Jewish Zionists wore yellow stars long before it was required by Nazi law, as a demonstration of their Jewish identity and pride, and as a reproach to assimilationist Jews. 6 years before the decree forcing Jews to wear the star, a Zionist newspaper proclaimed, "Wear it with pride, the yellow star." Similar terrible ironies abound between Zionism and the Nazi state. For example, at the time of Eichmann's trial in Jerusalem, marriage between Jews and non-Jews was not recognized in Israel, as it was not by the Nuremberg laws of 1935, which prohibited marriage between Jewish and Gentile Germans as a form of bestiality. This is, of course, not the same, but it is troubling. By Hannah Arendt's evaluations, underdog claims of superiority fed the paranoia and hatred of their oppressors and created an essentialist basis for their ideology. Quote, "Politically, it is not important whether God or nature is thought to be the origin of a people. In both cases, however exalted the claim for one's own people, Peoples are transformed into animal species so that a Russian appears as different from a German as a wolf is from a fox. A divine people lives in a world in which it is the born persecutor of all other weaker species, or the born victim of all other stronger species. Only the rules of the animal kingdom can possibly apply to its political destiny. This evaluation, of course, is marked by a Western rationalist understanding of the animal kingdom, itself deeply worth disputing. The historic Jewish claim to divine chosenness seemed like a threat to the Volkish claim to natural chosenness. It threatened their fragile identity. Quote, "The hatred of the racists against the Jews sprang from a superstitious apprehension that it actually might be the Jews, and not themselves, whom God had chosen. There was an element of feeble-minded resentment against a people who, it was feared, had received a rationally incomprehensible guarantee that they would emerge eventually, and in spite of appearances, as the final victors in world history." This fear was enhanced by Nietzsche's unhelpful proclamations about the revolutionary character of the Jewish people, to which we shall return in Section 7. German Gentile peasants, united with nature, associated with healthy masculinity and comfort with using force, were seen as the temples of Volkish power. However, the largely middle-class writers and thinkers of the movement seldom imagined becoming peasants themselves. Instead, Volkish ideologues imagined the rehabilitation of the bourgeoisie and workers into the patriarchal merchant families and artisans of the legendary past. These roles were quickly disappearing, and their constituents blamed modernity. Increasingly, they came to represent that modernity in terms of the Jew. We have a tendency to think of Nazi anti-Semitism as psychopathic, inexplicable. We picture the most notorious Nazis frothing at the mouths with hatred, conducting horrifying experiments, madmen. Psychopathy was certainly part of anti-Semitism, but its appeal became much broader as Volkish thinkers generalized the image of the Jew as a dehumanized monster, the enemy of the people. Volkish writers described them as an inherently unstable, parasitic people, as they are landless, forever foreign. Within this mindset, Jews are inherently incompatible with the German landscape, or with anywhere except Israel. In their occupancy of Germany, they seek to steal land from the peasants. They are shallowly materialistic, always wanting the best instead of what is eternally good and eternally denied them, peace and rootedness. They are the capitalist snake coiled around the peasant tree. In the Volkish imagination, Jews became both the epitome of and the symbol for hated and feared modernity. Lagarde, another early contributor to the Volkish ideology, framed a spiritual angle on the primacy of Germans and the consequential, quote, abhorrence of the Jew, which accused the Jew of possessing a sterile religion and a consequently materialistic nature, of entertaining an international conspiracy, and of being incompatible aliens on German soil. This led to the prophecy of a mortal struggle between Germans and Jews. As the idea of national unity had never been fully assimilated into German culture, it seemed quite possible that Jews, perceived as a state within the German state, could overthrow it, or were in the process of doing so culturally. In modern America, this kind of conspiracy thinking is still prevalent on the right. Then and there, as now and here, the perceived threat to the German people was not limited to the Jew, but encompasses the lumpen proletariat, the Jew, dissidents, migrants, and cities, progress, modernity, internationalism. All of this maps well onto the current American white supremacist belief structure. The lumpen is the urban youth of color, the peasants are rural whites, and Jews are journalists, college professors, and stock traders, making money while shaping our society to their own ends. The new myth that small towns in the U.S. Midwest are now run by Sharia law after a large influx of Muslim immigrants is even more transparent in its conspiratorial racism. In fact, if the interaction between class and ethnicity in our society could be reduced to a simple conspiracy theory, it would operate the other way. The strength of Volkish ideology lay not in logic, but in its widespread appeal to the rich and middle class. At first a fringe intellectual philosophy, it spread by way of, for example, Wagner's circle of artists and intellectuals, who transmitted these ideas to school teachers, who influenced the minds of the young. Novels were written extolling the virtues of the Volk and the sins of the enemy. Volkish plays were performed in great masses, a unifying group experience of reliving moments of Germanic power, a public cult. This continued to happen well into the Nazi era, within the form of various theatrical depictions of Nazi unity. Racist theories gave a visual, concrete direction to the whole man, a perfect Aryan at peace with his environment. This racism, along with theosophy, sun worship, the Nordic beauty cult, and strategically deployed gay yearning, the desire for class peace, and the influences of youth culture all eventually went into the makeup of the early members of the National Socialist Party. All of this has to do with a new idea of class mobility and a vague sense that democracy might be desirable, and other factors at play in the European transition from the feudal state into enclosure. The economic situation was bad during the years of Volkish formation, and some intellectuals were concerned that communism might become the most popular response. For these types, Eugene Diedrichs made Volkism respectable under the banner New Romanticism, an alternative to positivism and materialism. This appealed to those who opposed capitalism and left radicalism alike, always a large racist constituency. Communism and related tendencies were thus marginalized as a Jewish sort of politics, their critique distorted for reactionary use. The popularization of anthropology and social Darwinism also made it possible for these ideas to become intellectually respectable. On the modern political level of the party, Pan-Germans, who called for the unification of all Germanic language peoples, constituted the strongest and most respectable of the Volkish groups. Quote, "Through it, Volkish ideas found firm footing within the establishment itself, and thus this organization must be ranked with the youth movement and the educational system as the chief transmitters of the German ideology from the pre-war to the post-war world." The literate, aristocratic bourgeoisie came to form the largest bloc within the Volkish ideology, which is amusing in light of their idealization of the peasant life. Those in power always prefer to believe the lives of those who work for them are idyllic, but seldom find it wise to ask them. The concept of Volk is based around a faith in natural essence that is a necessary part of fascism. People must be defined in order to be controlled, separated, placed, and othered. There must be something definitively good, natural, right about our side. The enemy must be to blame for all of the problems in the world. Racism sometimes takes a cultural rather than a physical approach to its othering, but I think it is not a stretch to say it is all essentialist. Without this basic agreement that people's differences are based in more than their experiences and actions, fascism and racism both crumble at their base. And, importantly, essentialism is a group phenomenon. Lagarde, quote, thought that the individual could be genuine only in a circumscribed form, that his uniqueness was derived from the peculiar character of the larger unit, the Volk. The individuality of the people is based on the facelessness of the member. This kind of terror erases the former ethical code and is able to justify itself purely through reference to its notion of nature. Quote, guilt and innocence become senseless notions. Guilty is he who stands in the way of the natural or historical process which has passed judgment over inferior races, over individuals unfit to live, over dying classes and decadent peoples. Terror is lawfulness, if law is the movement of some superhuman force, nature or history. Hannah Arendt. This assignment of criminal guilt to groups of racialized subjects at the forefront of capitalist development is familiar from many different reactionary atmospheres. One thinks of the current backlash in the U.S. against Latino workers, who are depicted as stealing jobs from white workers. Without a developed anti-capitalist perspective, and within a culture of generalized racism, it is easy for the nearest target to take all the blame. The Volkish mythology of blood and soil gave this instance of the general phenomenon an intense power. When white Americans feel a sense of entitlement, it is based in a culture of white supremacy and a sense of we were here first. But the here first sentiment can only go back so far, as most are uneasily aware, and there is a theoretical basis of general equality and freedom in U.S. society with which even an enthusiastic racist must negotiate. Hopefully, this crack in U.S. racist ideology can be widened. For those thinking within the Volkisch framework, non-Jewish Germans were essentially here first, and the laws of nature meant that they both inevitably would, and, in a dialectical contradiction common to fascism, must desperately strive to, maintain dominance, evicting the perceived outsiders by force as necessary. This survival thinking displaced other, gentler values. Not all Volks were anti-Semitic. Many were humanists, and some had deep respect for German Jews, whom they saw as constituting a Volk of their own, or as assimilated into German society. Egede, for example, was a non-racist Volkisch thinker, but his ideas around youth education were hijacked for use in explicitly racist schools, much as identity politics have been hijacked by the alt-right in the US today. Langbehn, a Volkisch racist who believed himself a messianic prophet, proved more influential than Egede. He declared that, quote, race is a pervasive and decisive force, was intensely anti-Semitic, and advocated racial subjugation, even slavery. Kant also played a part. Quote, Volkisch theorists found a theory of race in the writings of Kant, which was based primarily on geographic factors, and held that geographically determined racial characteristics were accompanied by an inner life force. Philology and anthropology also contributed to racial grouping and characterizing. Before racism as a group commitment could take hold in Germany, the rational and scientific affirmation of race as a physical reality was necessary. Racism as a manifestation of essentialism within fascism. Quote, every society needs a certain proportion of citizens who have to be detested. Benito Mussolini. Quote, with race theories, you can prove or disprove anything you want. Max Weber. While various forms of bigotry have existed since antiquity, mid-19th century European societies legitimized race thinking as the only practical, realistic way to understand the world. At the time, scientific racism was only seen as possibly problematic by the most liberal observers, and then only when people attempted to divine interracial characteristics from external ones. European and British scientists, in the context of their renewed attempts to discover and classify every living thing on the planet, a project previously begun by Aristotle, sought to similarly classify human beings by our variance and surface characteristics. Modern scientists now agree, although there are certainly racist detractors, that those characteristics vary more than they concur within ethnicities. It is also true that most people of a supposedly single ethnic heritage possess genes that originate from many parts of the globe. Race, scientists have concluded, is a social construct with no basis in biology. Therefore, while science bears a heavy legacy of blame for aiding in the manufacturing and legitimizing of race, our war against the construct and its destructive forms must be a social one, though it is worth keeping an eye on the scientists now theorizing epigenetics and toying with gene manipulation through CRISPR. While the Nazi history of anti-Semitism and other sorts of racialized hatred is well known, the Italian legacy demonstrates that hatred is not necessary to an essentialist fascist enterprise. Mussolini was not, apparently, personally racist or anti-Semitic, and only adopted that rhetoric as a practical maneuver, complying with Nazi Germany's racial policies as the two became allies. Aaron Gillette argues that Mussolini's central goal was Italian improvement and unification. He found it helpful to identify an other, an enemy without, to diminish atomization within. Max Weber says that, quote, the concept of race exists only in the context of communal identity. Insofar as Mussolini wanted to create a racial unity in Italy, it was of the race of the fascist man rather than of the Aryan. Nietzsche, not the anti-Semites, was his reference point, as he said he wanted to shift Italy, quote, from a race of slaves to a race of masters. This kind of differentialist racism, even when it is not based in an emotionally felt bigotry, contributes heavily to the mythic idea of people of color, including those Jews whom we would now perceive as white, as a contamination, a plague, germs to be eradicated, hence the fear among these sorts of racists of miscegenation. It also helps to create the emotional distance needed to take inhumane measures against the other. Quote, how can one feel sympathy with the virus? Lack of personal hatred aside, Mussolini's administration created the 1938 Manifesto of Racial Politics, statements spreading paranoia around non-white birth rates, black riots in the U.S., and other talking points of racist propaganda, and established legal measures prohibiting Jewish people from a wide range of roles and activities. Although they did not, in practice, apply to most Jews, as war veterans, their families, and members of the Fascist Party themselves were exempted. While this may seem shocking, quote, there can hardly have been a Jewish family without at least one member in the Fascist Party, for this happened at a time when Jews, like other Italians, had been flocking for almost 20 years into the fascist movement, since positions in the civil service were open only to members. Italian scientific racism also served as ethical justification for the immensely bloody Italian occupation of Ethiopia. Elsewhere, just as tactically, Mussolini distanced himself somewhat from racism without entirely disclaiming it. Quote, there are thousands of Negroes who fight as soldiers under the Italian flag and who have always fought magnificently for us and themselves. This can be said too of the Arabs. We fascists acknowledge the existence of races, their differences, and their hierarchy, but we do not propose to present ourselves to the world as the embodiment of the white race set against other races. We do not intend to make ourselves the preachers of segregation and of racial hatreds when we see that our fiercest critics are not the Negroes of Harlem, who could profitably use their time to take care of their colleagues who are daily and Christianly lynched in the United States, but are mostly genuine whites in Europe and America. Observe how sly and self-serving this equivocation is. One is reminded of the short-lived talks between the Nation of Islam and the American Nazi Party over their mutual interest in separatism. It does not seem, thankfully, that Mussolini's rhetoric met with any such reciprocal interest. The process of racial theorizing in Italy was heavily influenced by Nazi race theory, Gillette argues, but in reaction against it rather than in compliance with it. Nazi and pre-Nazi racial theorists claimed that people of Nordic descent, particularly Germans, best exemplified the virtues of their Aryan ancestors and used Italy as an example of degenerate Aryan descendants. Italians did not much appreciate this. Mussolini himself was subject to an anthropometrical examination while a youthful vagabond in Switzerland, and resented it intensely. Italians, quote, considered the arrogant German anti-Italian rhetoric to be a consequence of a deep-seated inferiority complex brought about by their parvenu status, lack of culture, and dislike by other peoples. Of course, Italy was suffering from its own inferiority complex over its lack of success as a nation-state, which contributed heavily to its impulse towards racialized unity. Was racial contamination and weakness the reason it had not succeeded? Some racial theorists claimed that Italy must have been contaminated by racial mixing during Roman imperial days, while others denied that the proud Italian blood could possibly be surmounted by foreign blood. All of this led to a, at best, dialectical approach to Italian racial theory, one that simultaneously attempted to disprove the German approach and assert its own version, but also tried, in later years, to stay compatible enough with German policy for the countries to remain allies. Italian theorists variously claimed that Italians were the true Aryans and Germans the degenerates, asserted the importance of the inherited culture of their Roman past, and discussed the effect of the physical environment in shaping national character. Cold climates produce cold people, but Italy's warm climate produces hot-blooded people, etc. Italian racism was also marked by intense debates between advocates of different branches. Spiritual or philosophical racism, biological racism, and Julius Evola's mystical racism all fought for theoretical supremacy, resulting in a fairly incoherent paralysis within the discourse. Because of the German academic emphasis on the sciences, biological racism was far more popular there, which made genocide more plausible in Germany than in Italy. The Italian church also resisted biological racism while wholly complying with philosophical racism. It had a vested interest in asserting that Jews, Muslims, and pagans were inferior to Christians, but also in maintaining the possibility of their conversion, a salvation not possible if evil lay in biology rather than the soul. Gillette indicts the scientific community for its role in creating and perpetrating racism throughout this period. Its attempts to classify humanity as it had done the rest of the natural world, its advancement of Lamarckian evolution, which seemed to justify biological racism, the extrapolation of Darwinism to social Darwinism, its ideas of biological purity, all of these gave racism a supposedly rational and inarguable basis without which it might not have led to so many murderous events. While scientists who believe themselves to be objective cannot be spared from this criticism, Gillette also points out that, quote, biologists and other academics found that giving their personal convictions a pseudoscientific gloss was immensely empowering for their careers. However, the responsibility borne by scientists does not lift any blame from philosophers. Without the writings of people like Comte Arthur de Gobineau, the father of European racism, the convictions of those biologists would perhaps not have formed. Gobineau, a French aristocrat, quote, appalled by the political legacy of the French Revolution, was one of the first to argue that miscegenation caused the downfall of European civilization. His Essay on the Inequality of the Races, written 70 years before fascism formed, is absolutely foundational to the creation of modern race concepts, essentialist differentiation of humans, and the justification of murderous action on that basis. He wrote it in a reactionary attempt to combat the universalizing ideas of the Enlightenment, and was a close friend of Wagner, quote, the primary source for the German composer's racist worldview. The longer one studies fascism, the more all the points converge. Lombroso's phrenology, used by the police to identify political radicals as well as social criminals, was also popular at the time, and influenced U.S. eugenics laws, which, in turn, served as templates for many of Hitler's genocidal endeavors. Arendt assigns some amount of blame to Hobbes' philosophy, popular with the colonizers of the time. She says that, rather than explaining a pre-existing phenomenon, the advance of Leviathan depends upon Hobbes' reduction of human nature into a brutal war of all against all, restrained only by government and class. Within Hobbes' world, not just a theoretical world, but one he has helped to create as one of the realities we sometimes dwell within, commodity alienation and violence over predicates are interrelated with fascism and biopower, and modern citizens must be content with all of it. The war of all against all, Arendt points out, quote, affords the best possible theoretical foundation for those naturalistic ideologies which hold nations to be tribes, separated from each other by nature, without any connection whatever, unconscious of the solidarity of mankind, and having in common only the instinct for self-preservation which man shares with the animal world. Essentialism justifies everything. Quote, imperialism would have necessitated the invention of racism as the only possible explanation and excuse for its deeds, even if no race thinking had ever existed in the civilized world. The incoherence of racism is matched only by its social power. It is striking how anti-Semitic caricatures of Jews as weak, incapable, and parasitic, while simultaneously in struggle for world domination and a serious threat to all Aryans, are projections of German and Italian desires and inferiority complexes. By destroying these external representations of their own felt inadequacy, these fascists hope to purify themselves internally as well as externally. We must refuse pity for those who fall into this basic psychological trap when it results in the death of millions. Understanding need not result in compassion. The opposite tendency is not one I can support wholeheartedly either. By Griffin's analysis, quote, meanwhile, all over the world, groups of populations are retrenching into their ethnic or cultural identity, many in a spirit of radical intolerance for the equivalent identity of others. Here he makes an equivalency that is false in all societies with a long-standing power inequality between various ethnicities and cultures, It is not the same for an American white person to get interested in their Nordic ancestry as it is for an American black person to explore their ethnic and cultural past, and it is certainly not the same for each of them to feel hostility towards the other. To reduce it in this way is to practice an intentional, racist ignorance of the historical context. However, as someone interested in abolishing the social construct of race, it is hard for me to feel excited about even the most positive manifestations of the tendency to affirm it. Arendt's examination of Benjamin Disraeli, the British Jewish statesman and imperialist, concludes, quote, Disraeli's discovery of race doctrines is one more proof of how well they serve to combat feelings of social inferiority. For if race doctrines finally served a much more sinister and immediately political purpose, it is still true that much of their plausibility and persuasiveness lay in the fact that they helped anybody feel himself an aristocrat who had been selected by birth on the strength of racial qualifications. His superstitious belief in blood and race, into which he mixed old romantic folk credulities about a powerful supranational connection between gold and blood, carried no suspicion of possible massacres, whether in Africa, Asia, or Europe proper. This willingness to believe in his race theories on the part of bourgeois society gave Disraeli, the only Jew of the 19th century, his share of genuine popularity. In the end, it was not his fault that the same trend that accounted for his singular great good fortune finally led to the great catastrophe of his people. Her tone on this last note is not wholly lacking in irony. There is something willful in the ignorance of racism, something bound up with power and the purposes of those with power. In her analysis of the Boer colonization of South Africa and enslavement of the peoples indigenous to the region, Arendt asserts that the Boers were actually unable to perceive those indigenous people as humans because their way of life was so profoundly different from that of white Europe. Quote, they were, as it were, natural human beings who lacked that specifically human character, the specifically human reality, so that when European men massacred them, they somehow were not aware that they had committed murder. The perception of the oppressor that these Africans were closer to nature than they were somehow never gave those people a higher status, although the oppressor is simultaneously able to condemn others, such as Jews, as unnatural. Essentialism is an all-purpose tool for the oppressor. Misogyny. Misogyny, another common manifestation of essentialism, is thickly woven into both German and Italian fascism. From a fascist perspective, modernity is decadence, is weakness, is society, is femininity. To resist it is to embrace virility, a strict enforcement of gender roles, and to valorize women's role as childbearers, a role fascists endowed with a natural connection to the land and biology and transmission of history. Feminists and other modern women were seen as absolute enemies, particularly in Germany. Fascist misogyny also led to the gendered mystification of the essential German connection to the land, the gendering of Jews as feminine and Aryans as masculine, and the reification of eminent masculinity as a self-fulfilling force for transcending social reality. Insofar as women are seen as property in patriarchal societies, and regarded suspiciously by men as the enemy who sleeps beside you, German male fears about German women having sex with Jewish men, thus contaminating themselves and their race, were a huge factor in the production of anti-Semitism. As was also the case in the first several hundred years of black and white interaction in the U.S., the reverse was not considered a serious transgression because of patriarchy operating on multiple levels. Quote, the image of the pure, blonde, spiritual, feminine German woman succumbing to the love of a Jew became a nightmare to the prophets of the race. A flyer distributed at the University of Frankfurt in the early 1920s declared it a sin, an unnatural act, for an Aryan girl to let herself become enamored of a Jew. It was a transgression tantamount to Eve succumbing to the sophistry of the serpent. Footnote. As Giorgio Agamben describes in his text Remnants of Auschwitz, the term Holocaust was traditionally used by Christians to refer to a burnt sacrifice of Jews they made to a god. Quote, "Not only does the term imply an unacceptable equation between crematoria and altars, it also continues a semantic heredity that is from its inception anti-Semitic." Following him, I use the word Shoah, disaster, throughout this text. I use it to refer not only to the murder, displacement, torture, incarceration, and other genocidal acts performed by Nazis against Jews, but also to the experiences of Roma, queer people, anti-fascists, and others during this era of German concentration camps. Almost unfortunately, people are just people. Women were victims of fascism on many levels. They were murdered in the Shoah, by fascist squads in Italy, and by Mussolini's adventure in Ethiopia. They were oppressed by the fascist imposition of strictly gendered roles, denied the ability to pursue self-determination in their own interests, and so on. Women were wildly active in the anti-fascist resistance movements, in existing Jewish escapes, and performing many subtle, quotidian gestures of resistance. See Ingrid Strobel's book Partisanas for an extremely intense account of the militant participation of various women in the anti-fascist struggles of the era. And, of course, women were also participants in the creation and continuance of fascism, even if they did so in pursuit of other goals. Male misogyny rarely exists for long without the collaboration of some women, who would have been better served, if not immediately or personally, to instead show defiance and solidarity with others who are oppressed. Homophobia is also a common manifestation of misogyny, and it took some interesting forms during this era, particularly in pre-fascist Germany. Every war needs its vanguard. In Germany, this force was called the Bund, meaning party. Distinct, of course, from the Bund that was an anti-fascist Jewish group in Russian Poland. It was created by young men returning home from the defeat of World War I. Some of them perhaps felt guilty for having failed their Volk. More were looking for some identity to fill the void of fighting for a state that had ceased to exist. The Bunden, George Moss reports, were sometimes formed explicitly on a homoerotic basis, that is, at surface platonic, but as a way to sublimate sexual energy into something, quote, more noble. Quote, "Within such a scheme, the homosexually inclined came to be regarded as the most socially creative individual, because the normal male directs his total sexual energy and affection towards his family. Eros here is essentially captured, circumscribed, and dissipated. This does not hold true for a homosexual, who is able to direct his surplus energy towards cosmic concerns, and, above all, towards cementing the ties of the true Bund." Unfortunately, these homosocial and homosexual experiences did nothing to produce compassion in the hearts of those who murdered thousands of queers in the coming Shoah. Their homosexual experiences and emotions had to remain unarticulated as such to remain accessible to them. And, as we know, the closeted are often the greatest homophobes. Implicit Volkish homosexuality thus became the emotional basis for explicit Nazi homophobia. The chapter Homosexuality and Fascism in Judith Halberstam's The Queer Art of Failure explores both this phenomenon and its upsetting inverse in greater depth. Men's enjoyment of each other was seen as a higher form of interaction than that found in mixed-sex company. The Bund was explicitly anti-feminist. By now, Jews were gendered female and Aryans male in the popular imagination. Sex and alcohol were excluded from the Bund, physical purity was emphasized, and male beauty celebrated. Nordic body culture began here and spread throughout society, with entire magazines dedicated to the celebration of the naked German male body. This formation served as an alternative to both Marxism and capitalist class society, based neither exclusively on collectivity or individualism, but instead on leadership, Volk, and community. However, the Bund were intentionally elitist and would not recruit or convert. They did not prove a durable political force, but served as a greenhouse for one. Ernst Röhm oversaw the murder of many Jews and leftist radicals in the streets as a commander of the SA during Hitler's rise to power. In 1933, his troops forced German officials to surrender power to the Nazis. It was well known that Röhm and many of his stormtrooper leaders were homosexuals. Hitler excused this as natural to a warrior society. However, Hitler came to see this warrior society as a double-edged sword. He did away with Röhm and other SA leadership in the Night of the Long Knives the next year, and shortly afterward declared homosexuality incompatible with Nazi values. Mussolini, a notable homophobe with concerns about the homosexual appeal of his own charismatic underlings and the military force that backed them, apparently spoke critically to Hitler about Röhm, influencing his decision. Notoriously, the current neo-fascist band Death in June has argued that the Nazi Party would have been an ethical and stable form of government had the Night of Long Knives not occurred, that Röhm and others in his clique would have steered the party in a better direction. This is a horrifying read, one that attempts to justify a kinder, gentler fascism, though the band claims that they are not fascist, and points to their gay member Douglas Pierce and collaborations with Jewish artists as evidence. Nevertheless, their heavy use of Nazi imagery and Pierce's blatantly racist statements show their allegiances. The lineage of mystified fascism, supported and enforced by a few people who are its destined enemies, may have begun with Röhm, but it continues today. Early fascists made other strange essentialist assertions, some of which combined race and gender. The racial theorist Cesare Serrano claimed the genetic material stored by women and transmitted to their offspring contained the, quote, psychic experiences and biological adaptations of the past, while men contribute an externally directed and energetic component. This, he felt, justified the claim that Italians had remained racially pure throughout their history, no matter what invasions they suffered. And, quote, to preserve this essential ability, a civilization has to avoid the feminization of male culture and retain a gendered division of labor in society. Another Italian racial theorist, Giulio Cogni, claimed that, quote, men were the intellect of the race, women were the life-givers, but women embody the nation in a way men never could. In fact, it was through a man's carnal connection with women that he was able to achieve a mystical union with his race. Thus epitomized as the race itself, women were forcibly made one with their role as childbearers and caregivers in a way that morality alone could not achieve. The Nazi propagandist Gregor Strasse asserted, for a man, military service is the most valuable form of participation in the state. For the woman, it is motherhood. There are African tribes where mothers who die in labor are buried with the same honors as warriors who have fallen in battle. While this appeal to the alleged traditions of African tribes may seem strange coming from the mouth of a Nazi, it is entirely consistent with the imperialist racist tendency to appropriate what one wants and to destroy the rest without remorse. A biological racist, Serrano attempted to bridge the gap between his pseudo-scientific views and what seemed socially necessary by arguing that becoming Christian somehow physically cleansed Jews, quote, in his veins would begin to flow Aryan blood. These are the sorts of metaphysical leaps necessitated by such strange amalgamations of philosophical and pseudoscientific arguments. Evola, for example, claimed that history went through gendered cycles. Quote, the noble stages were masculine. Thus, Evola claimed that these stages harmonized with the hierarchical, heroic, warlike, decisive, and classical values that characterized men. The later degenerate phases were feminine. Societies in these phases indulged in a lust of promiscuity, communism, natural rights, and general equality that were characterized by women. He preferred the masculine cycles, of course. Evola saw Jews of all genders and women of all races as the most serious threats to the fascist revival. It is tempting to agree with him. It would be useful if being a member of an oppressed group seen as threatening to those in power meant that group had internal validity, historical unity, and shared values of struggle. But this is also essentialism, however optimistic. Many essentialist feminists have argued along similar lines as Evola, just with more affection for promiscuity, communism, natural rights, and general equality, an affection I share myself. Nevertheless, liking something does not make it so, and the only conditions we live in are ones we generate from ourselves and impose upon each other. History and narrative carry real and deadly weight, but they can, just possibly, be refused. Fascist activism, going to the people. Volkish activists started many land projects as a lifestyle choice and a political gesture against modernity and urban life. They represented the search for the middle way between capitalism and Marxism, and a return to the soil as a central source of spiritual sustenance. Certain slogans were common between them: free the land and free the money, from immigrants and Jews, that is, but the projects showed some interesting political variants. Eden was probably the most successful. A semi-socialist land project at first, it became Volkish and racist within 20 years of its founding. It was integrated into the Nazi system, then later into the GDR, and still survives today. Midgard was a more radically Volkish proposal, an Aryan land project that would be a generator of racial energy. It would have a senate of wise old men who dealt with the outside world, no money or trade, a court of honor for settling grievances, children trained by Volkish means until they were 16, and polygamy. This last point, however, became too controversial for the plan to be adopted. Utopic German settlements were also begun in Africa, Paraguay, and Mexico. The youth movement was even more successful. It was officially founded in 1901 as a hiking association for schoolboys. By 1911, there were 15,000 members. Its motto was, "Youth among itself," resolutely free of adults and dedicated to the Volkish ideology. They sought to liberate youth from the strictures of modernity through teaching them to identify with nature in hopes of subverting the existing order. Another motto? To maintain oneself in spite of all the powers that be. Physical and emotional toughness and deeds above all else were idealized. At its most militant end lay the Ardamen, German youth knights who sought to take back the land from immigrants and industry. The Bund partly grew out of the youth groups, generated by their intensive gender segregation, idealization of masculine beauty and physical prowess, and the charismatic men who led them. The same creeping ideology spread throughout the schools. At first there were Volkish teachers, then there came Volkish schools. The lessons taught there paved the way for the eventual social reaction to the crisis of German defeat in World War I. Volkish schools became the rule in Germany, not the exception. Their very history tests encouraged them to discard Christian perspectives and rely on love of the homeland instead. The schools adapted the British public school system, already meant to emphasize nationalism, physical education, and sports, to include freedom for youth and the access to the land necessary to have a whole, vital experience of the Volk. The schools taught their students to believe in German nature and show their dedication to the welfare of the Volk. As time went on, discrimination against Jews became institutionalized in the schools, with explicitly anti-Semitic officials. By the end, there were no anti-racist faculty in the colleges. At best, teachers remained silent and did not directly participate in anti-Semitic activity. While the youth movement prepared the ground for the Nazis, they did not care much for each other at first. The youth, especially the Bund, disdained Hitler for his vulgar taste, fanaticism, and proletarianization of the party. They were critical of Nazis appealing for the votes of the masses and participating in party politics. Nazis, for their part, criticized the effeteness of the youth movement and its ineffectiveness at promoting the revolution. By Moss's analysis, quote, the Nazis also used the appeal of the Third Way, the opposition to bourgeois society, but they combined this with the building of a mass political party. Moreover, the German Revolution which they advocated did not become the captive of vague experiences and mystical ecstasies. Instead, it was made concrete and brought down to earth, for in their hands the German Revolution became an anti-Jewish revolution. The social aims of the youth movement were modified by directing the revolution against the enemy within rather than against the existing class structure. Contrary to the hopes of the youth movement, the success of the German Revolution increased in direct proportion to its diversion into an anti-Jewish revolution. Still, the youth movement and the land projects generalized Volkisch core beliefs. The use of such projects for fascists is summarized well in this passage from the sometime National Secretary of the Italian Fascist Party, Achille Starace. He wrote it to direct the mission of a bureau he oversaw that was designed to regulate Italian free time, to make it fall in accordance with the aims of the state. Quote, "Go to the people, to educate them, to raise them, to improve them physically and morally, to encourage them to love their land, their village, their family, their home, to impart the desire to know the true face of the fatherland by traveling along its roads and pausing with fresh eyes to admire its infinite beauties. Finally, to help them affectionately in every step of their lives, guaranteeing individuals and their families that moral and economic well-being to which the Italian people, renewed by fascism, have for the first time been granted the right thanks to a new and full understanding of their duties." Here are two classic elements of fascist rhetoric: blood and soil and the push for individual, nation, state concordance. If the Italian landscape shapes the Italian people, and the true form of Italian governance and culture is fascism, then it is a noble and sacred duty to align the three, and any divergence is a necessarily bad and malformed thing that ought to be corrected. This is essentialism turned openly political, a self-justifying, self-perpetrating, and fascist line of thought based on assertions about nature. Italian essentialism was always troubled, however, by debate over true Italian ethnicity, resentment about German framing around Italy, and the lack of total conviction in their anti-Semitism. Violence was a necessary emulsifier for this ideological brew.